This is an old-fashioned 20th century concept, which is I want you to go out and actually see what's happening. And Amanda did that. She went to South Korea, Poland, Finland, with students and picked a very good device, a Time Magazine-like device, which was, let me actually follow American students who go into that school. And so this is one of the most interesting, smartest books about education. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Walter. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I was running a few minutes late, and I was having flashbacks to being late to the Time morning meeting. And it was really, I just was like sweating, and I was worried.
Was it that intimidating back then?
No.
I thought we had a fun time.
I just, I was like 12, first of all.
Yeah.
And I was so excited to be there, and I loved working for Walter, and wish you'd stayed longer, but I know you had other things to do. So it's great to be here. It's a great excuse to get some time with you and all of you, so thank you for coming.
We have some books available. Unfortunately, we don't have enough, so quickly grab one if you want one signed. But she'll sign book plates, too, and make sure you get this book. This book is a very important book. I thought we would focus, I'm going to talk a little while, but I see so many people in this room who know much more than I do about the subject. I thought we would focus actually on one of your three countries, which is Poland, partly because it's the most dramatic change, partly because I guess 1 in 6 kids live in poverty in Poland, which is somewhat comparable to the 1 in 5 in the United States. So it's not like comparing a system with Finland in which there are demographic differences, partly because it was so wonderful. Did you have a video of the kids in Poland? Somebody said so, yeah.
One of the things that I've learned in education reporting is how valuable it is to hear from kids themselves. And it doesn't happen enough, but to prove this point, I wanted to I brought a couple very short videos from the kids themselves. And this is a video of a young man named Tom who went from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he was in high school, to Wrocław, Poland. And Tom was sort of an independent guy. He loved alti music, and he read a lot of Chekhov and philosophy and played the cello, and he never quite fit into his high school in Gettysburg, which was really about a lot of things, but mostly football. And so he had this idea, this romantic idea, that if he could spend a year studying abroad and living with a host family in Poland, then he would be reading philosophy in smoke-filled coffee shops in Eastern Europe.
But by the way, he did. Yes, right.
Yeah,
he finds this amazing coffee shop filled with smoke and philosophy books.
He took me there, and I was like, man, I forgot about smoke and coffee shops.
Right. It has its upside and downside, yeah.
He's going to talk here just for 1 minute about why he left his high school in Poland, in Pennsylvania, and what it was like there, particularly the technology that they had. This was a sort of middling high school in Gettysburg, and what Poland was like by contrast. And you'll see one of the things about kids is that they can be kind of blunt. They're non-ideological, but they are direct. So let's let Tom speak for himself.
Basically, high school just was kind of a stagnant environment for me.
Turn it up, please.
What was important in high school? It's like prom, football games, dating people, and there was no one wanted to actually learn anything, and no one wanted to discover the world or something. I think high school could definitely be more engaging, but it's not a question of how much technology we have in the classroom, of whether we have iPads and laptops, because all of my classes we do have laptops, and in all of my classes we use smartboards. And what do kids do on their laptops? They play flash games, and smartboards don't work all the time, and if they do, then you're not doing anything that you wouldn't do on a chalkboard. The classroom's a much more sober environment. There's no joking around between student and teacher like there is in America. And there's certainly no talking back, and there's no conflict in class.
So one of the things that all three American kids I followed noticed right away was how old-fashioned their school facilities were, and rather lackluster in most cases, even in Korea and Finland, which are very wired places. But Tom's school in Gettysburg, for example, had a smartboard, an interactive digital whiteboard in every classroom, and his Polish high school had no smartboards. I mean, this didn't have a cafeteria. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's a whole different level. And I bring this up, it's sort of an aesthetic thing, and who knows what it means. But it is something you notice anecdotally when you travel to these other countries, is that the facilities are often an afterthought. It's particularly true in Korea and Poland, with some exceptions. But on average, they are not quite as enamored with shiny objects, I think, as we are. And that's not to say that, you know, iPads won't revolutionize learning, but there's no evidence that that's happened so far. So that was one interesting thing that they noticed.
And the Minister of Education was a guy named Hanke. Is that the way you pronounce it?
That's right.
And he had come in, if I remember correctly, in 1999 or so, before Tom gets there, right?
Right.
And he does a education reform that felt quite similar to what we're trying to do here in terms of rigor and assessment and a few other things. Explain that.
In some ways it was. I mean, Poland was in every country that's really risen to the top of the world educationally has run into a kind of economic existential moment where they're on the brink of becoming something really important and central to the economy of the world, or irrelevant. And this is true in Finland in the 1960s, and this was true in Korea, obviously, after the war, and this is true in Poland more recently. In 2000, before the reforms kicked in, Polish 15-year-olds performed below average for the developed world in a test of critical thinking and math, reading, and science.
Is that the PISA test?
That's the PISA test.
Yeah, and they first did the PISA test
in 2000.
Yeah, in 2000, right as the reforms were about to happen.
So it was kind of like a before sample to see what was happening, which was very lucky for Poland.
And so you said, I'm sorry, you said there are approximately 21st in the world, way below the United States.
Worse than that, yes. Below average for the developed world, below the United States. You know, about what they thought they were, actually. And so it was kind of depressing, but they were doing all these reforms. At the same time, this Minister Hanke that you mentioned came in, and he was actually a scientist, had very little experience. You know, he was a professor. He didn't have a lot of experience with
chemistry,
the politics,
right?
Yes, of education. And this, in retrospect, was seen as maybe a blessing, because he may not have tried to do the things that he did had he known how hard it would be. But with this economic anxiety, they were able to get lucky and make a series of changes. There's basically 5 things that they did very quickly. So one was that they increased teacher training, professional development. Very hard to say whether, as you all know, very hard to say whether that's a good use of money. It really varies quite a bit. And that's true in Poland. They're not sure how helpful that was. And then they instituted a more rigorous set of core standards for what kids should know. So this may sound familiar.
Well, it sounds familiar on the Common Core. Yeah. And actually, I'm going to get to Ross, because I just read a paper he was doing on the Common Core and civic life. But they were not only more rigorous, and I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but this is important as we try to do this in the U.S., there were not as many of them. I mean, it was not as if they sort of said, you need to know this, and this.
Right.
It was fewer core standards, deeper.
Right. So it's more coherence. And this is true in almost every top-performing education country. At some point, everybody has kind of, you know, huddled up and come up with a list of more coherent, lucid, clear, deeper, fewer things everyone should know at every grade level. Now, usually that means leaving teachers a lot of autonomy about methods, like how to do that. And that is the next thing they did in Poland, was to give teachers a little more freedom to choose their own textbooks, their own curriculum, that kind of thing. It wasn't a ton of freedom, but more than they had before. And then the next thing they did was they did institute a series of standardized tests, although significantly fewer than we have here, to see how kids were doing at different sort of milestones along the way, aligned to these standards. And then the last thing they did, and this turned out to be the most important, although they didn't know it at the time, was that they delayed tracking their kids. So most countries, including the United States, divide kids up based on ability at some point and give them different content, right? And there's different ways to do this. In Poland, they, would, like many countries, they would send kids at age 15 to vocational schools or more academic university tracks. It turns out all around the world, the longer you wait to do this, the later you keep all kids together, the better all kids do. It's kind of counterintuitive in some ways, but it does seem, for a variety of reasons, some of which are hard to put your finger on, it does seem to elevate the expectations of everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's also somewhat intuitive that if you're told, okay, you've been left behind, you're not going to be as good of a student.
Yeah, on the other hand, you'd think maybe for the more advanced kids, that might hold them back, right, to keep everybody together. And that's not typically what you see. Another argument against this, the other reason I think it's counterintuitive is that, you know, for a lot of kids, they're kind of not into, you know, some of the traditional academic subjects. And the vocational track is more interesting, it's more real, it's more pragmatic. So you might think, well, that's actually, the sooner the better, you know, to keep them engaged. But anyway, they delayed this in Poland from age 15 to 16, which meant they had to open up 4,000 new middle schools to absorb all these kids, you know, who were going to be together. And this was very controversial, as you can imagine. All these things were. One thing they did was give municipalities more autonomy as a kind of quid pro quo in order to do this. Gave them a little more control. But it self-selected for really kind of the most ambitious principals who wanted to open these new schools, and then they brought their team of teachers with them. So again, hard to say what's causing what here. But they saw this huge lift. So in 2003, Poland was then at average for the developed world, significant increase in their PISA results. 2006, they started to creep up and up and up. 2012, which results came out after the book, they're above average for the developed world, well above the United States. Poland now has...
Wait, go back and repeat that. They are well above
yes,
the United
well
States,
above the United States.
having started well behind, and it's only been a
Right,
decade.
which is wild. And to me, this is it, the whole reason to talk about this stuff, because it's hopeful, you know? Poland who's been to Poland? Okay, this is, you know, this ain't Finland. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, this is a complicated country. Finland's a complicated country too, but Poland is a big, sprawling country with a long history of trauma and dislocation, with division, distrust, legitimate distrust for the central government. This is a place with 16% child poverty. You know, the school that Tom went to from Pennsylvania in Wrocław, his best friend was, you know, mugged with a knife point the day before I got there or something. It was in a kind of shady neighborhood known as the Bermuda Triangle because sometimes people disappeared. And so, you know, this is not a sort of utopia. This is a place that's complicated and difficult, and yet, and by the way, spends dramatically less per student on K through 12 education than
Half.
Yes, it's gone up a bit since then, but it's still dramatically
Although
less.
it's probably hard to compare, but yeah.
It is hard to compare.
Yeah.
But
still, I mean, two things are astonishing. If you walked out on DuPont Circle, a very, you know, smart, savvy thing, and you said, who is better educationally, who's better prepared, kids in an industrial town in Poland or kids here, most people would think American kids are better educated than kids in Poland.
Right.
Secondly, what you have is going from one of the worst in the world to much better than the United States in 10 years based on very strict reform, not strict, but very clear and energetic reforms.
right, and they continued. I mean, this is the other thing that I think sometimes people forget. I mean, this doesn't just end. I mean, they again adjusted their Common Core standards in 2009, giving teachers yet still more autonomy and making them even more kind of coherent. So there's been other things that have happened. They changed the testing so that it had more challenging math. I mean, you know, you have to, these are living policies. You have to adjust. But the last thing I'd want to say about Poland is, you know, about a month before these new results, the latest PISA results came out in December, just a couple months ago. About a month before that, there was a move to vote in Parliament to rescind all of the reforms.
Why does that sound familiar?
So I'm hoping this is like perversely reassuring to know that in every country, people are unsatisfied, people feel threatened, people are upset. Like there's enormous amount of political complexity, as I don't need to tell you, coming from New Orleans, in these decisions that has as much to do with history and respect and how people feel and what people worry about with their children, which is such a hard emotional thing. And the data is important, right? But it hasn't changed the minds of many Poles who would like to go back to the way things were.
But they didn't.
Not yet. But they might.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, I think part of it is it's hard The research that Poland has done is pretty convincing to me about this change in tracking having a pretty big impact. But at the end of the day, you can't say with 100% certainty what's causing what, right? So you could have your own theories about whether or not the reforms were successful, and I'm sure some were better than others, right?
Are there institutional resistance to change the way we have, whether it be the unions or an establishment?
Yeah.
Explain that.
So every country that I've been to has a pretty strong teachers union, and every principal has complaints about the contract. There is variance in how adversarial the relationship is between the unions, the union leadership and management. And that is important because if they really hate each other and there's no trust at all, as you might see in, say, Chicago, it's very hard to get anything done, right? But the presence of the union doesn't seem to be the deciding factor, or even the strength, but more like the professionalism and the trust between government and union.
One of the raw points between government and unions here, and to some extent I want you to talk about in Poland, is using assessments and these new tests, not just to assess the students, but to assess the teachers.
Yes, this is not something you see to the same extent in these other countries, which isn't to say they won't do that. The United States tends to set the tone for a lot of education reforms, almost regardless of our actual outcomes. So there are countries like Korea has started building in more teacher evaluation schemes and trying to kind of...
Are those good or bad things?
Well, on paper, they're really good. I mean, it makes sense, right, to give people feedback about how they're doing and set clear goals and that kind of thing. In reality, as was the case in DC, where we are right now, sometimes if teachers are not bought into this, if they feel like it's being done in a way that's just sort of not legitimate, then they will not get on board. So in Korea, one of the things that was part of their evaluation schemes, for example, was the other teachers are supposed to, it's like 360-degree evaluation, so other teachers are supposed to evaluate you. So the teachers hated this whole thing so much that they refused to evaluate each other in many schools. And the ones who did fail on the rubric were supposed to go back for teacher training, and many of them just didn't show up. So you see a lot of resistance that makes this hard. In Korea, when I talked to the Minister of Education, he said he would very much like to use value-added data and evaluations, which is where we see how much a teacher's students' test scores have grown over time, and use that as part of their evaluation. And this is what's been so controversial here. And he said he would love to do that, but it was really hard to figure out, because Korea has so many teachers teaching a single student math, for example, not only at the school, but in the after-school tutoring industry, which is vast and sophisticated. So it would be really hard to say, like, what's causing, even harder than here.
One of the things that Amanda does in a really masterly way is part of journalism that involves both data but also real people and anecdotes. Sometimes people think that a whole lot of anecdotes equals data, which it doesn't, and sometimes people think analyzing a whole lot of data gives you a picture, which it doesn't. So by merging the two, you're able to say, here's real people, but here's this thing. Tell us about the real person for a moment, Tom, and how it affected him. Yeah. I do vaguely remember, and now that I saw him in the video, I was reminded of it, that the first thing his host family wants to do when they look at him is, oh my God, we've got to fatten you up. It looks like they don't feed you at home.
Right, he's really skinny.
Because he's sort of whippet, thin. How does it work for him?
So Tom, he went off on this, what he admits fully to be a kind of romantic quest to go see this other country. He had not traveled a lot and was born and raised in Gettysburg, which is a pretty small place. It's 2 hours away from here, but it's a world away. So he ends up in Wrocław. His Polish is not good, so he struggles for a while. The first day of class, his teacher in the math class in Poland. And I bring this up because math is a particular weakness of Americans at every age level, including adults, compared to their peers around the world, and at every socioeconomic level, which is interesting. This is not true with reading. So I think it's important not to exaggerate and say we're terrible and everything, because we're not. We're pretty much average. And we're a little below average in math and science. And if you look at even our richest kids, our top quartile of most affluent American 15-year-olds, who, by the way, are quite well off compared to their peers around the world, have very highly educated parents and smart boards all around and all these advantages, those kids score below their affluent peers in 26 other countries.
Wow.
In math on the PISA. This, to me, is a under-noticed fact that I think should wake people up to the idea that while our poverty issue is real and wrenching and urgent, and while our gap in race scores at different levels is heartbreaking, this is something that goes through our whole country, especially in math. So I feel like you have to see the whole picture if you're going to fix it.
Let's take a quick detour on the math thing. I have a theory, which I'll toss out, but I'd like you to give the facts here, which is one reason that's true is because, as you say, adults are bad at math here and stuff, is that we think, including people in this room, that you could be a smart, well-educated, well-rounded person, and you would never dare joke that you don't know a Picasso or you don't know Shakespeare or whatever. But you can say, oh, I don't know the difference between a differential equation and and a polynomial, right. Or I don't know the difference between a gene and a chromosome, and that somehow it's socially acceptable for adults in this country to almost be proud of the fact that they don't know calculus, so they can't do math. Right. That's astonishing to me, and I'm sure it must filter down. Definitely. Where you take kids to art museums and baseball games and everything else. Yeah. But you don't sort of feel that, I mean, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson would have thought you were a Philistine if you didn't keep up with math and science.
So you wonder how that happened.
We can. Why did that happen?
How did that happen? And it didn't happen with reading. I mean, I see it in my own kids. My kid attends public school in D.C., and reading is like science, and an art. But I mean, they've got it down. There's like levels and differentiated groups and a lot of back and forth with the parents, and everyone knows whether they do it or not, you're supposed to read to your kid, right? I mean, that's a cliche at this point. Whether they do it or not, you know as a parent what your role is. Right. What is your role as a parent of a young child in math? You don't know because no one's telling you, right? But in other countries, there's a role for parents to talk about numbers, to use numbers like puzzles with little kids from the time they're very small, And so I don't know what the answer is as to where that disconnect happened, but somewhere along the way, it became, like you say, acceptable to say you're not good at math, which is something that Tom, our student from Pennsylvania, said, and he's a very, very bright kid, lots of advantages, and he
he loved European existential philosophers who would say, I can't do math.
Right. And it started in 8th grade, which is very common for kids around the U.S., and he just started slipping, and he was embarrassed, and he got a D, and he just decided that he was going to stay away from this as much as possible. So he gets to Poland his first day. The teacher asks him to come up to the board and solve a polynomial problem that he knew he could do. He felt like he could do it. So he goes up there. And everyone's watching this American kid, right? That no one really knows. It's it's a high-stress situation, and he's trying to solve it, and he's trying, and something's not. He's not sure where he made the mistake, but he can tell. And then the chalk breaks and falls on the ground, and he hears a few snickers behind him from the kids, and he's like, oh man. So he tries, and finally, this goes on like way too long, and finally the Polish teacher tells him he can sit down. And another student comes up and solves it, and it was like this devastating
And she never
moment.
calls on him again, right?
That's right.
In math.
Yeah. So, I think now Tom is at Vassar. He's in college and majoring philosophy, and which I tried to just be supportive about. I was like, all right. The
world needs more Vassar-educated philosophers.
Yes, that's what the world needs. No, he's a great kid. He's going to be fine. But the thing is, he loves music. He loves philosophy. And if he had known how important math is to those disciplines, think of how awesome that could have been, like for him to. But now he doesn't take math in college.
Right. And in some ways, especially as he should have learned in Central Europe, all great philosophy now connects with math.
Right.
It's all logical, mathematical-based philosophy. And Well, anyway, that's a different topic, a different time. I'm sorry, I've dominated too much. Let me open it up. And as you're waiting for your question, I did read this morning. I'm going to put you on the spot, if you don't mind, Ross. Ross Weiner, who most of you know runs our education program, sitting over here. And I want you to comment on this. We've been looking at the core, the Common Core, core standards, whatever you want to call it. And I think we have to keep renaming it as the backlash keeps unfairly coming up. But one of the really cool things about the Common Core in America is that these new core standards ask or require some civic, not only civic education, but the notion that you're being prepared to be a citizen of the United States. I actually am working on 2 different versions of the core just on the side so I can learn it. I do, and those of you are welcome to go look at it on Khan Academy if you want to look at, it's under the world history thing, but it's American civics. We do the Declaration of Independence. And we parse it sentence by sentence. We talk about how Jefferson wrote a first draft that said we hold these truths to be sacred. We explain why they changed it to self-evident. And it is a deep dive into the Declaration of Independence. It's one of 3 documents, I think I read in your paper, that are part of the core standards. But, and we're also doing that with Amplify, which is Joel Klein saying, also trying to learn how digitally these new curricula deep dive into the Common Core and into the question of civics education, which is what I care about. You wrote a paper that, are you going to publish it? Yeah. And tell us about it. Yeah.
Well, I was just looking at that we sort of have defined it for the Common Core that it's just about reading and math. And the paper is about actually, if you look deeper into the Common Core standards, you know, it's really actually, I think it's actually a loftier ambition of preparing people to take their place in society. And one of the things that I think is so exciting about the Common Core, and I was drawing on this in particular around being ready to be a citizen, but it's really about this recognition that to be ready to participate is much deeper. It demands a deeper both knowledge but also ability to apply skills than sort of our somewhat simpler reading and math tests that we've had. So I am actually curious, like, how do you see you know, the countries that you looked at sort of balancing this? You absolutely have to get really strong in basic skills, but at some point it's got to be about you're doing that because there's something. So how do they just sort of define that, and how does it play out in ways that you think are maybe different or maybe similar than how we do it in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is something that people in Korea and Singapore and much of China really agonize over, right? They feel like, okay, we're doing way too much rote learning, way too much memorization, and it's the Americans who have figured out creative thinking, and we have to go over there on junkets and watch them. And so they do a lot of that. And there are some classrooms where we are first in the world on interactive creative thinking, using information to solve problems and to think for yourself, right? So that's definitely, I think, a latent possibility for the United States. One thing you notice from talking to kids who have studied here and lived here and also lived abroad is that American teachers are typically on their own to the open-ended questions, was repeatedly things like, you know, I loved how my American teacher cared about me. My American teacher, you could talk to her. Especially kids coming from, say, Italy or Germany. There was a real sense of relief that the classroom wasn't so sort of hierarchical and rigid. That is a huge potential asset if combined with rigorous learning. And this gets to your point where you need both, right? The sort of surprising thing is that the PISA test that we've mentioned, which is administered to 500,000 15-year-olds every 3 years in 65 countries, that test, which is from the OECD, was designed really to get at this. Your ability not to memorize knowledge, but to take it and do something useful with it, to solve problems, to make a cogent argument in written form. Those kinds of things that we have to do all day long in our jobs and lives today. So I took the PISA to see if that was the case. And I mean, you know, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Like I felt myself having to think, which was a weird sensation while taking a standardized test. And I frequently had to write out answers in long form. There was clearly no right answer. It sort of depended on how compelling your argument was. It's graded by humans in large part, so that's expensive. and very much unlike the kinds of tests that we do here in most places. So on that test of critical thinking, Korea is at the top of the world. So what does that mean? You know, I think it is true they're doing a lot of rote learning. And I think it is true that that is important to a certain point, right? And then they're also having to think. So they're doing advanced math at a much, I mean, you know, we have below average, the percentage of kids doing advanced level of math in the US is below average for the developed world. And Poland now has a greater percentage of kids doing that than Finland, which is kind of shocking when you think about Poland has a 4% child poverty rate. So I'm all over the place. But yeah, I think these things interact at some point, and it's hard to separate. What if anything, I think American, huge, sweeping, probably unfair generalization, but if anything, what we do is err on the side of like interactivity and freedom and discussion. And I've been in a lot of classrooms where there's a lot of discussion happening and not a lot of learning.
But also Ross makes a somewhat different point, which I'd like Ross to comment on, which is it's not only to be able to think critically, think imaginatively, think usefully, but also to become a good citizen. This is one reason we're educating you. I mean, obviously one reason is to add to the economy. The other is to make you self-sufficient. But another is to make you a good citizen. You make the argument at the end of your paper, which I'm going to push back, not push back on, but challenge you on, which is that should be a selling proposition when we try to stop Louisiana legislatures and others from getting rid of core standards, that it helps you become a better American citizen. This also looks like it may play into the fears of people who say, this is the federal government trying to indoctrinate you and make you Obama-like or something. So how would you square that argument?
Yeah, so this is, right, we're in this interesting political
Is that
moment.
microphone on? Yeah. Yeah.
And
Could you all
so
get that working, Aaron, please? Yeah.
I was, you know, I'm trying to figure out how do we get people to recognize that in the Common Core, it does only prescribe, it only requires just a very few texts that everybody has to read. It demands a lot of reading, a much more complex text, but it doesn't say what kids ought to be reading, except for the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln's second inaugural address. Somewhat idiosyncratic choice for if there's only going to be three. I guess the first two, I think you'd get pretty well unanimous support for, and that's
I will
actually
vote for the third as well.
Well, so
that
it's
is an
right.
awesome
It
speech.
is. No, and I still cry
Better
when I go to the
angels
Lincoln
of your
Memorial
nature,
and read
yeah.
it. So, but I think the question is, can we get to a place where people can recognize that we'd actually have a healthier democracy if everybody had their own personal understanding of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? And I'm trying to ask this question of, is that something that could potentially cut across the polarized conversation we're having today? Could everybody agree on that? That not you have to, think the Second Amendment means you can or can't regulate, possession of guns around schools, but you need to know what the Second Amendment is.
Yeah.
You need to be able to read that decision and to decide which arguments
But
are
let
most
me ask
compelling.
you this. Suppose then they add King's letter from a Birmingham jail.
Well, and that's where we have such a challenge. I mean, the Common Core, right, it prescribes so little. And so on the one hand, it respects that everywhere, this history of local control. But what is it that binds us together as Americans? There must be some amount. And just, bringing it back to this conversation, I would love to know, I was struck in the book and in your comments about, right, this economic existentialism, this anxiety was in some ways the trigger for other places to take this seriously. And it is much of the case making today. Our competitiveness demands. And I wonder, on either side of that, one, how compelling do you think that is here? I worry actually that it's compelling to an extent, but that when you push and that when people have to swallow the implications of these reforms, they no longer are willing to go along. All of a sudden they said, well, we'll be fine. Everybody said Japan was going to overtake us in the 80s and we're still number one, so we don't need your reforms. So I'm curious what you think about the strength of this competitiveness argument here, and what do you think it needs to be complemented with? And also there, like is there much about sort of national identity that infuses how they've gone about education reform?
I think certainly in Finland there is, and it would be interesting to look back. So Finland has a Common Core set of standards, which is weirdly translated to English and available on the web for all to see. But it started out as 800 pages long before 1985, a very small print, and you can imagine the teachers did not love this. Finland in general has gone from more of a top-down accountability system to more of a autonomy system for teachers with a lot of trust. And that is definitely a good trajectory to follow, assuming you're doing a really good job of selecting, training, and supporting your teachers. Another topic. But anyway, in 1985, they shortened that set of standards to 300 pages, and they've continued sort of whittling it down. But to this day, there's a set of standards in Finland for every single subject, not just reading and math, but history, art, music, phys ed. I was just reading the phys ed standards, I don't know why, yesterday. But there were things in there about being a healthy citizen. I mean, it was kind of all linked to not just, you have to know what some of the common viruses are and how your body works, but you need to know, what makes you a healthy person and a contributing member of society. In Finland's case, there was kind of a long-standing sense of oppression from some of their neighboring countries, Russia and Sweden, and just to name a couple. And so there was a sense when these reforms were all happening there in the 60s and 70s of really, Finnish identity, the Finnish language, and so that's all kind of infused in there. But it is a challenge of the United States. It's all about competing boogeymen, right? Like, which are you more scared of? Are you more scared of the federal government, or your kid having not many good opportunities for a job that's interesting and being able to thrive? And I think a lot of people would say the first in America.
Yeah, I think the Tea Party backlash against the Common Core is problematic, and pushing it as the federal government will tell you how to be a good citizen is going to be a problematic approach unless you really keep it to just the Declaration and the Constitution. And that's where I think it's going to be an interesting debate, because that's probably not the correct answer, but it's the best answer if you're trying to fend off a Tea Party backlash against the core standards. But that's just my thoughts. Let's open it up. Yes, ma'am. Oh, hey. Is that Ann? Of Ann's head,
First
please.
of all, that's a marvelous book. I can't wait to read it. I have a question. My daughter teaches second grade in a low-income school in Baltimore. And one of the problems, which I'm not sure you discuss here, is the diverse ethnicity. In that school, it's maybe over half black, African-American, quite a few Hispanics, some Koreans, Africans. And so and plus a lot of them have ADD, psychological problems. How does what you're saying, how can you bring that group together to even have one idea of what a civic society is? Did I ask too big of a question?
No, I think that's a good question. Okay. It's one that comes up a lot. It is true that Finland is not a great case study for a diverse, heterogeneous population. Nor is Korea, nor is Poland. I mean, despite its poverty, Poland is pretty white. Ontario would be a much better example, which is more diverse than 25 states in the U.S. There's a huge immigrant intake in parts of Canada that, Canada's an education powerhouse now. I actually wanted Canada to be one of the countries I focused on in the book, but there were no American exchange students going to Canada. Yeah. So that was my shtick. I needed a gimmick.
Right?
Yeah, right. So, but Canada is a very compelling example of a place. If you look at the trajectory of Canada, even just on the PISA test, but also other things like high school graduation, college attainment, you see it just a really impressive steep curve up over the past 40 years, specifically in the last 15 years. Now, some of that is happening in extremely diverse schools. Now, part of the complexity here is that a lot of the immigrants who come to Canada have to be pretty well off to begin with to get there, like from India, for example. If Indians could walk across the border into Canada, it would not be the same. So there is a difference there that's important to acknowledge. At the same time, I'm torn on this because I feel like, unfortunately, most of our schools are not diverse. Most of our schools are more segregated than ever. And the challenge is that, having 95% low-income African-American kids in your schools, many schools that I've covered around here as a reporter, your odds are stacked. It's very hard to manage that as a teacher or a principal. Not impossible, as we've seen in case studies all around the country. But it requires a very strong leader, it requires a strong community, it requires some support services, really great teachers, lots of things. If you truly had a diverse school, let's say a third low-income kids, it'd be easier to manage, right? That's like the school my kid goes to, right? Still not easy, but easier. And so in a weird way, I feel like on the one hand, the US is better positioned to deal with some of the challenges of the future because we've been grappling with issues of diversity for much longer than a place like Finland. It's just now. I mean, I went to a school in Finland that has 30% immigrants, most of them refugees from places like Somalia and Iraq. And that school is performing above average for Finland, which means above average for almost everywhere. And it was weird, it was interesting, because the teachers, when I talked to them about their students' backgrounds, they were very uncomfortable. They didn't want to talk about their students' challenges at home. As one teacher told me, I want to treat each of them as if they're a pearl. I don't want to start making excuses for them, which sounds just like the culture of excuses that we've been talking about here and has become sometimes controversial in charter schools and so forth.
Right.
But it's like they don't have this background that we have. They don't have this history, and that's good and bad, right? I mean, on the one hand, they don't know what they're doing. On the other hand, they don't have this ready narrative they can just pull down whenever they need it. I mean, I was looking back at a 1955 New York Times piece the other day about the poor performance of some schools in Harlem. And it was the exact same language. The people were defending it, saying, what can you expect? These, well, back then they said, these black children, what can you expect? This is all they can do. It was the exact same language, and that is so deeply rooted in the United States. It's really hard to separate out what is real, because some of it's really real challenges, and what is a history of low expectations and bias, right? And this is a big subject. But.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, okay, Garrett.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm Garrett Mitchell. I'm curious to know, I have not read the book, only some reviews before coming here, and I'm curious to know whether this experience in these three countries, whether you deal with this in the book or whether it's the next book, whether it has led you to think sort of prescriptively about, okay, having learned this from Poland and Finland and South Korea, here are some things that we might try.
Yeah.
I mean, do you get prescriptive in the book?
Go
Are you
ahead.
headed in that direction?
Yeah, I do, and I actually changed my mind on some things as I went. And it did seem to me, having seen these countries, that all of the agony that we've been going through in some, not most, of our districts over evaluating teachers, firing poor performing teachers, getting rid of tenure in a very small number of places, including DC, all of the pain. I didn't see that as a path that has been traveled before. Like, that might work, but it's not how these other countries got to where they were. And what I saw that was most inspiring was putting that kind of intense, high bar accountability on the beginning of the profession. Makes a lot more sense. So the United States educates twice as many teachers as we need in about 1,400 ed schools of wildly varying quality and selectivity, many of which admit pretty much anyone who's interested, many of which have very low standards, particularly in math, and will often have sort of special math classes for teachers that are not part of the math department. This is true in many countries, it turns out. We are not the only ones who do this. Norway does this to its detriment. If you look at Norway, Norway is not performing anywhere near Finland. So Finland shut down its ed schools in 1968 and moved them to the most elite universities in the country, 8 top universities. So it was controversial. There was a fear that only the elites would be able to become teachers. But what the effect it had over time was that, not only were you getting people who had the advantage of a strong education to teach, which is obviously helpful but not enough, you were sending a signal to everyone in the country. And this is what I'd underestimated. You're sending a signal to everyone in the country. When getting into ed school is as hard as getting into MIT in the United States, you aren't just saying education is important, you're acting like it. You know who picks up on that? Parents, taxpayers, politicians, and kids. Kids in Finland know how hard it is to be a teacher. And they don't like all their teachers, and they complain about them. But there's like a baseline credibility
They're like
that's
being
really
doctors.
important.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, this is particularly interesting. One of the things about Teach for America is that really smart, top of the class kids at, you know, whether it's Harvard or Howard or wherever, want to get into Teach for America.
Right.
And when they don't, and sometimes they'll call me. I'll say, well, why don't you just become a teacher? Why don't you? Why do you have to do it this way? You could. And you know, if they're going to change it at Harvard because of the new dean of the ed school. But if you're at Harvard, you can't go to Harvard and just as a normal course of study say, I want to be a teacher. I'm going to get trained as a teacher and major in education and get a credential, which is, you know, what you need. You can sort of do it in a mixed thing with the ed school.
You're not going to get a lot of respect from your peers either, right?
And you're not going to you get a lot of respect from your peers if you're preening around and you've been picked for Teach for America. But if you're the same kid and you're going around saying, I'm majoring in education, I want to be a teacher, and I'm going to get credentialed through the Harvard School of Education. And so Harvard always thought it was beneath its dignity, and I can say that of Yale and many other places, Stanford, to train people to be teachers, even though it had an ed school. And the new dean of the Harvard Ed School said he's going to try to totally reverse that and make it just like you want to go to Harvard to be an engineer or be a philosophy major. You can go to Harvard and say, I want to be a teacher and be proud of it.
That's exciting. I mean, and there are a couple states that are trying, they allege that they are trying to really get serious about this finally, because people have been complaining about this for hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years in America. And so, you know, the fact that, and when I talk to people who've run big city districts, and I say, well, why haven't you done this? Why haven't you made it serious? Like, train teachers seriously, give them a year at least, like they do in Finland, of hands-on training with a master teacher in the classroom. Why haven't you done this? You know, you've done all these incredible, ridiculous, over-the-top hard fights. Why not this? And they'll say, oh, you have no idea. Higher ed is so much harder to deal with than the teachers union. And I'm like, really? Really?
We
Maybe?
could shut down the teacher training colleges and make ed schools in America train teachers in a rigorous way. And you wouldn't get the bottom 10% of the class going into being teachers. You get the top 10%.
Look, so Rhode Island, Deborah Gist in Rhode Island, one of the first things she found out when she came there was that Rhode Island has the lowest cut score in the country, had the lowest cut score in the country for how you had to score on the SAT or different tests to get into their colleges of education. So she raised it to the highest in the country. Right away she could do that, just issue an order, which isn't that high, P.S. And so she did that. It was very controversial, and the dean of the biggest education college in Rhode Island, you know, said this was going to disenfranchise their students. They were going to end up with all white candidates for teaching. It was going to destroy, you know, the diversity and be unfair. And in fact, when I checked back with him 2 years later, he said that in fact that's what had happened and it was terrible, and I asked him to check the actual stats. And it turned out that the percentage of minority teachers in training at that college was actually up slightly.
Have they gotten rid of that dean yet?
I don't know.
I mean, anybody who's that clueless.
Well, but it shows you how emotion and fear and expectations
and
can
racism.
really, and you know what, that's true too. I mean, to me, I couldn't believe the things that were being said to reporters about how, oh, now we're not going to have any African-American teachers. Well, guess what? Guess what the real challenge, I think 2% of our teachers are African-American men. 2%. Now, you can't tell me that some of that, there's a lot of things going on there. Some of it is, this is not a profession that gets the kind of respect and pay it deserves, right?
A lot of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I would like is more men in the classroom, in addition to more minorities. I would like more men in the classroom. And one way to get the attention of American males is to make the profession serious, prestigious, and much more appealing than it is, right? So you can potentially get there over time. One of the things that Finland's union did, where they ran an advertisement in the 80s that said, Finland has the best educated teachers in the world. That's all they said. Imagine being able to say that, you know, and it be true. It's a powerful thing, you know, and I think in Rhode Island's case, what they did is they admitted, look, there are some great teachers who have low GPAs and low SAT scores. That's for sure. I mean, no doubt, I have seen some outstanding teachers here in DC who would not have gotten into Finland's system. So what Rhode Island did was they said, well, if you have a really strong candidate, we'll issue a waiver. Send us a request, we'll issue a waiver, explain what you're up to, and you can, they're going to get some hands-on training and we'll see how it goes. When I checked with Deborah Gist before the book came out, it was about 2 or 3 years after she'd made this decision, she had received 0 waiver requests. 0. So there's a lot going on here.
Astonishing.
Yeah.
Questions further? Yes, way back. And sorry, I'll catch you next. Yeah.
I understand that on the latest PISA test.
Can we get, Aaron, can we please get these microphones working better?
Hello? Can you hear me? I
I'll
understand that on the latest PISA test, the states of Connecticut and Massachusetts asked that their scores be pulled out. And when they were, the results showed that they were doing pretty well. Now, are they, in your opinion, more like the countries that you studied in your book? And
Yeah.
is that the reason, perhaps, for those relatively high scores?
So the question is about Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Florida actually spent the money to take a big enough sample of the PISA tests in 2012 that they could pull out those results for their states. Most states can't do that, even if they wanted to. And what they found was, as you're saying, Massachusetts is top tier of the world. I mean, it's not at the level of Singapore, Japan, or Korea, but it's at the level of Finland and Poland. Massachusetts is getting it done. I'm not all places in Massachusetts. Boston has still some big struggles in some of its schools, as you probably know. But it's a remarkable case study. And it was not the case in Connecticut, although Connecticut did okay, better than average for the US for sure. Florida, not a good scene, not good results, right? Even if you look at their top quartile socioeconomic kids, they were not performing well on this test. So it is really interesting to do that. And now there is actually a version of the PISA test that individual schools and districts can take, which is really interesting. And some districts have done it. Some charter schools have done it. Fairfax County of Virginia did it last year. So it is a way to actually say, OK, put all this abstract nonsense aside. How are we actually doing on an international measuring stick? And it can be very surprising. It can be very surprising.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
If you, has a longitudinal study ever been done of a Teach for America environment where for several years, you've had this sort of caliber that you have at Teach for America teach, and then evaluate those children?
So Mathematica, I think, has done
Mathematica has done 2 studies, yeah.
and the best, sort of most independent, rigorous studies, which I think were longitudinal. And they did find that the Teach for America teachers were producing greater gains as far as test scores can measure in their students on average than other teachers. They do tend to leave the profession, obviously, although most do not leave education. And many new teachers leave the profession anyway. I mean, we have a huge retention problem. I would guess if you could take those same Teach for America candidates and spend 4 years teaching them and giving them a year in the classroom with a master teacher and giving them direct feedback the way teachers in Finland get, it would be really interesting to see. Right now the gains are there, they're not huge though.
Mm-hmm. I'll say, just from my experience working with it, it's good to have a mix. Every school, when you, both anecdotally and through the cross study data, if you have a school that has fresh, new, really eager, top-of-the-class types who are going to go in there and work till 10 at night with their students and go visit them home, it energizes the school. It's also good to have veteran teachers there. One of the models of, one of the formats of Teach for America is you make a 2-year commitment to an underserved school. 68% of people who join Teach for America stay in education and have stayed in education after that. So there's some upside even if they leave the classroom, meaning the last 2 superintendents in this city were people who would not have been teachers or in education had it not been Teach for America. Both, whatever you may think of them, Michelle Rhee and Kaya Henderson were both people who got brought into the profession because when they were in college, this was a way to draw people in. Likewise, if you look everywhere from Tennessee to Louisiana to Chicago to Newark, they're all run by people who were Teach for America core members. So it's bringing bright people in. The downside is there is a cycling through, and they don't stay in the classroom as regular teachers more than an average, well, 2-year commitment, but usually 3, 4 years, whatever it may be. So I would never, even as an advocate of Teach for America, say that should be the whole system. I would say that it's useful to raise the prestige of the profession so that, to take Harvard, for example, I'll say something that probably I'm going to be sorry is streaming video. It used to be if you got a job offer from a Wall Street bank or hedge fund, you'd preen around the yard being very proud. Now you're ashamed to tell people, but if you got a job being a teacher, you're proud because you made it through. And what we almost have to do is start spin-offs of Teach for America, which have happened in New Orleans, like the New Teachers Project, New Teachers New Orleans, New Schools New Orleans, in various places, to say, yeah, if you're coming out of Tulane or Xavier or LSU, we're going to try to recruit the top people into being teachers. So it scales up more, and there are different models of it. But I do think that every serious study has shown that even in a first year or second year, a core member produces greater gains, especially on math, than a traditional teacher. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about the teacher training in Finland. In addition to the year in the classroom with the master teacher, do they major in a specific subject? Because, for example, my son is doing music education, so he's doing a performance program and an education program, so he has to do that for 5 years to qualify as a music teacher. Is the same true that they'd have to be a math major and do the education, and therefore it takes longer because they have almost like a double major?
My understanding is that you enter an education college in your second year of, so when you apply, let me just give you a tangible example. Kim's teacher in Finland who taught Finnish, so like an English teacher here, she applied out of high school. She applied to one of the universities that does teacher training, which at that time was accepting 20% of applicants based on a combination of your equivalent of your SAT scores and your grades, but also she had to read, since she wanted to be a Finnish teacher, which she told them, she needed to read a series of Finnish literature books and write long essays about them as part of her application. And so they're kind of, assessing your seriousness about your passion for this subject and also your education. And so she did that. She was blown away, happy to get admitted. And then she spent 2 years really studying Finnish literature. And then the next 2 years were really much more focused on education. It typically is actually 5 years in Finland because you get a master's. But it doesn't necessarily need to be based on what they're doing. And I think some of that was probably like some of the ed schools here. I think some of it was not super helpful to her, and some of it, particularly the in-classroom time, was incredibly helpful. So it's a mix of things. I mean, I would take like the match teacher residency program and some of the smaller, like the work Doug Lemov is doing with Uncommon Schools, some of the things that a very small number of innovative ed programs are doing here, and I would hold them up against any program in Finland any day.
Stephen, and then, yeah.
Thanks very much. Can we go back to technology in schools? Because you touched on it a couple of times. So the FCC chairman just proudly announced the $2 billion, and Apple and Microsoft and others are throwing in $750 million, and we're going to get 99% of our schools connected to high-speed broadband. And we're not going to have the computer over there, as Tom Wheeler said. We're going to have the computer or the laptop or the tablet on the desk where it belongs. Mm-hmm. Are we getting things wrong here, or are you optimistic about this great push towards technology in the classroom?
Oh man, really? This doesn't make me popular, but I am kind of I'm kind of a downer on. I mean, I think it's important to have high-speed internet connection for anyone to be productive in their job, including kids and teachers. Okay. The history of U.S. spending on ed tech is not a good one. So the amount of money spent doesn't correlate strongly with the returns in learning. That doesn't mean that's not going to change. I think some of the customized learning and blended learning is exciting, but I am much more confident about people and the importance of human capital And then they will find and use great tools if that support is offered to them. But I feel like there's a temptation historically, especially in the US, to believe that buying things will make things better. And that is not true. So it's not just true about technology in the classroom, right? That's a critique of our whole culture. But it is especially true in healthcare and education and certain things where we have hard, knotty problems that are political, and we want to show gains. And we want to be able to say $2 billion, and we want to be able to say, look at this MRI, and we do this all the time. And so it was not something I was looking for, actually, but it's something that the kids brought up again and again. And when I surveyed hundreds of exchange students, a majority of them said they saw more technology in their US classrooms. There's not good data on this, unfortunately, on relative investments in technology around the world. And you're going to have some Korean showcase high schools that are amazingly wired, for sure. But if you just parachute randomly into a school in some of these places, you typically don't see the kind of technology that the parents in my neighborhood spend a lot of money at auctions trying to buy for their schools. So.
I just had a question about, sure, thank you. I just had a question about common culture, and Tom specifically that's come from Gettysburg, and he said he's an outlier a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so in Poland, you didn't mention anything about the common culture and the fact that they, in 10 years, took their system. Was there a change in the common culture, or was it all academic machinations? And the real question is about, the good and negative, specifically the negative aspects of common culture in the U.S. that need to be changed, so parents want to teach.
Right.
So, yeah, go ahead.
So my general feeling is that culture cannot change in just 3 to 6 years the way that it did in Poland, but it can change.
So the culture for, okay.
So the data on Poland shows dramatic gains in 3 to 6 years from 2000 to 2006. They started seeing gains in 2003 and steady gains over time. So you wouldn't expect culture to change that quickly. At the same time, if you think of culture as sort of like, it's sort of like a minefield, right? And you have to step on the right parts for things to happen. And so there's latent values in our culture, just as there are in other cultures, that are incredibly conducive to high-level learning, okay? And there are other values that are totally counter to high-level learning, right? Our history of racism is totally counter to what we're talking about here today, right? This is a big problem, big minefield. And then we have a long history of meritocracy. You may say we don't achieve it, but compared to many, many countries, we have a belief that you should, regardless of what family you were born into, be able to climb your way to the top. I know we don't always achieve it, but that is a value, right? And so there are all these values, some of which rise to the top because of historical and economic and political contexts, and some of which are still latent. And I think what I see around the world is when countries become education superpowers, they conveniently remember all of these, we've always valued education in Finland, and we've always valued, in Confucius and this and that. Well, there was a 10% high school graduation rate in Finland in 1950, 10%. So you may have valued it, but it was latent, right? And that's what makes me a little bit optimistic about the U.S. is that for all of our problems, and I could talk ad nauseum about those, we do have some values that are really exciting for really finally getting serious about educating and educating virtually all our kids to higher levels of critical thinking.
Last question. Sorry. Well, last two questions. Why don't we pair them, do them quickly since we're about to end.
I'm not an educator. I haven't read the book yet, but I will. I'm a parent of 4, 3 of which are girls. My children are of color, and I appreciate your comments about the impact of racism, but I'm very interested in the difference in the cultures and countries around gender and educating girls.
Okay.
And then my question was, did you notice any difference in family involvement in all of these cases?
All right, last two questions.
very quickly, gender doesn't work the way we might expect. I don't know what your expectations were, but around the world, girls in the developed world tend to do better in reading. There are some places where it's particularly alarming how badly boys are doing. And one of those places is Finland. The gap between boys and girls is quite worrisome in Finland. Now, the average boy is still doing better than our average kid, so we're sort of relative degrees, but it is a concern. There's still in many places a gap in math between boys and girls, where boys are doing a little better, but that gap is closing. So, it's tricky. I think honestly, where gender really plays a role, perhaps. I mean, obviously it plays lots of roles, but one role that I don't often think of as a gender issue, but it is the prestige of teaching and how seriously Harvard University treats teaching. This is a female profession. It wasn't always, interestingly, but it is. And there is a certain second-class citizenship that comes with that historically, and I think it's not serious. And maybe that's why math is not a strong point. When you test middle school teachers to be in America, they have very unimpressive math skills, middle school math teachers to be, compared to their peers around the world. And in fact, score right in the middle, just like American kids. So there's a lot there, but that's one answer. And as for family involvement, it's a great question. Probably changed my own behavior as a parent more than anything else that I've done in this project. American parents are actually relatively involved, to the degree you can measure that, compared to parents around the world, and more involved than they have been pretty much ever. So it's kind of shocking, actually. The data that exists suggests they are quite involved. How they are involved varies quite a bit from what you would see in Finland, Poland, and Korea. And this sometimes gets me in trouble, like the technology one, but I actually see this as good news. In a study of 13 different regions and countries around the world, when you looked at parent behavior and kids' outcomes, what you saw was that the more time parents spent reading to their kids when they were little, talking to them as they got older about the news of the day, about movies, about books, those kinds of interactive things, the better kids did on a test of critical thinking and reading by age 15, even after controlling for family background. Same group. Kids whose parents spent more time, the more time parents spent volunteering in the PTA and extracurricular activities, coaching soccer, the worse their kids did on a test of critical thinking and reading at age 15, even after controlling for socioeconomic status. So I get two reactions to this, especially from mothers. One is, thank God I can stop doing all of this that I was doing, because the schools in America ask you to do a lot of stuff that's not connected to learning. Okay, and then there's another reaction, which is, hey, this is our community. Like, these things we're doing are important, and they help our kid have a rich and full experience in school, and all the kids at the school, and that's true too. But I would argue, given that we are not achieving world-class results in academics, particularly in math, at any socioeconomic level, that should be the priority, to do things that actually lead to learning and see yourself as a coach for your kids in learning, right? In fact, transfer everything we do and say about sports to learning as parents. Like, they literally do a finer place. And then if there's time and energy left over for you to, bake cookies for the bake sale or whatever it is you want to do, awesome. But I think having priority, having a focus is really important.
Are you still studying New Orleans?
I love New Orleans for lots of reasons. My first book was about human behavior and disasters, and this book is about education, so I get there whenever I can, and it's endlessly fascinating to me to see that story evolve.
And were there any lessons from Apple? You
oh,
mentioned
yes.
that to me.
Funny you should ask.
Yeah.
So I had asked Walter, what do you think Apple and Finland have in common? All the top performing countries. And I think one thing they have in common is focus. And you've talked about this and written about this. Any hard, dynamic, complex job, you need focus. This is something that we lack in our education system more than almost anything else. We're not even sure we know what school's about. Like, is it about self-esteem? Is it about yearbook? Is it about sports? What is it about?
Citizenship, yeah.
Yeah, but in these countries, they've come to a place, for various reasons, where they more or less know that school is first and foremost about learning. And that is actually, it sounds kind of like an obvious, but once you have that consensus, it's much easier to focus and kind of ignore some of the noise and distractions that plague our schools.
This is a phenomenally important book. I urge you to buy it. Grab a copy there if Politics and Prose can produce it. Amanda will sign that and book plates. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. That was perfect. That was really good.